Hi, I'm Suze Woolf, and I'm going to try to give a talk and a sort of demo online. This is a first for me in this time of pandemic. Let's hope to stay healthy and compassionate as we weather this crisis together. I've been painting almost exclusively in watercolor for the last 15 years or so. Though I spent many years in high-tech and graphic design, I have a background in fine art. I take my paints with me wherever I go, which is mostly outdoors. Last summer, I coordinated the Northwest Watercolor Society's plein air mornings, and will again this year if we get past the virus. I know I don't have to tell you why watercolor, but let me explain why it fits me so well. I can take it to all those outdoor places, and it's fast to set up and do. You don't see any of these warnings on water. Reflected light bouncing back to the eye through a transparent pigment from white paper just looks clean. Our substrates have a more luminous quality than canvas or opaque white pigment. But more than anything, it's the way the paints mix. If I put down two blobs of oil paint next to each other, they just sit there. With our free-flowing solvent, water, they interact in ways no other medium does. Like many watercolor painters, I've been on a long journey learning to let go of over-control and just let the paint do its thing. Most of us are inspired by natural beauty. Many of us start out with a desire to create an emotional souvenir of an inspiring location. There's a long historical tradition in both art and conservation of landscape painting. The European romantic movement, pastoral beauty, the Hudson River School in the U.S., the idea of the sublime beauty with a little fear, and the Group of Seven 100 years later in Canada. Publication of paintings helped create our national parks. For me, I have a personal lifetime of joyous backcountry travels. I think of these paintings as love letters to the planet. Thomas Moran was part of the 1871 Hayden expedition to Yellowstone that later became the USGS. Frederick Dellenbaugh painted and wrote about Zion Canyon. Publication helped start the push for its monument status. Railroads hired artists to encourage visitors to take the railroad to come see the parks. I like to say you can be the artist in residence, like in the national parks, or you can be an artist in residence, like in art colonies. There are profound personal and artistic benefits to both. I can look back at each one I've done and see some surprising change in my thinking or practices that resulted from them. I paint landscapes for the joy of them, but I become aware of their issues. 12 years ago, I went on a hike through a freshly burned over area that changed my life. The devastation was creepy and beautiful at the same time. We lucked out last year in Washington State, but just like climate change, you can't assume that if we have a cold winter, it's not getting warmer overall. If anyone is curious, I can send you all the sources for all these statements. So I began painting what I was seeing. You can see that I kept the basic shapes of the photo, but eliminated or simplified some forms and exaggerated color. This one reverses the usual rule that warm colors advance and cools recede. Most such rules can be broken, but it helps to know how they work before you try to. I wanted to try squeezing out pigment for some of the forms. Those dark trees in the middle distance were done with a thick water pigment mixture in a ketchup bottle. I got interested at one point in painting on gessoed paper. Color is more vivid, you can see the texture of the gesso depending on how it was applied, and you can get almost fresco-like qualities by rubbing the dried paint with a damp rag. But because the paint doesn't soak into the plastic surface, it's difficult to get smooth washes or soft edges. I started out as usual, hiking around to do landscapes, but I had this huge studio space, and everything I put on the wall looked so dinky. So I did the largest work I'd ever done. These are also on gessoed paper. One of the administrative staff said, You should take those out into the real forest." So I did. After I got them home and varnished, and with the help of 6 friends, I wrapped them around real trees in the snow. It was an artistic peak moment. You might be seeing the inside of the tree, its future, or a completely surprising display of outdoor art. This gives you a sense of their scale. They're wrapped around concrete forms in my driveway. One of the visiting speakers, Simon Starling, had done watercolors of desert wildflowers using the exhaust of his prototype electric bicycle, which is air and water. The light bulb went on for me. I went down to the sculpture department and borrowed a soldering iron to draw with. Many people have asked me why not use charcoal, since it's burned wood, but I don't actually like working with it. These pieces were a great reminder that size and occlusion are all you really need to create an illusion of space. I tried burning paintings too. The foreground trees were quote-unquote painted with a wood-burning tool. I used my daughter's chef's torch for these foreground trees. The edges of this draw painting are singed. Since some paper is made from wood, I wanted to try making molds of charred wood and casting paper pulp into them. I made casts of 4 sides of the same burned log and also painted it, top left, or drew it with a wood-burning tool, bottom right. I realized that what really got my neurons buzzing in a burned landscape was the charred areas of individual trees, and began painting exclusively that in 2012. My first few were rectangular. While hiking along, I suddenly realized there was no reason paper always had to be a rectangle. I could make it any shape I wanted, so I started tearing the paper to match the contour of the trees. I painted such trees in the Southwest, in the North Cascades, as well as in Oregon, British Columbia, Alberta, Wyoming, and Montana. Back to the Southwest, and back home in the North Cascades again. This last is the largest one I've done yet, and when packed for transport, is too big to fit in my car. I tried hanging 12 of the originals from the ceiling in several places. Then I tried printing them on fabric, which feels more ephemeral, like the forest itself, and is much easier to ship. This installation of up to 30 of the fabric trees is on tour around the U.S. through 2022. One of my residencies had a grant to support collaborations. I worked with a wildland firefighter and author Lorena Williams, who wrote individual stories for half of the trees. Books are logical for someone who works in a series. It's great to have a 3D alternative to 2D work. It's such a different experience than seeing a painting on the wall. They're sequential and intimate. I started by making books from prints of my paintings. With some, I used actual paintings. After a while, I realized I enjoyed selecting materials that fit the subject matter more than I cared whether there were images in them. Like the burned forests, I began to see beetle-killed bark and trees everywhere I went. Now, I realize there's no watercolor here. I'm going to flip through these quickly. I mostly want to show how many different places my interest in watercolor landscapes has taken me. I think it's more important to go where your ideas take you than what medium you use. I keep exploring different forms, materials, and techniques. I like to say these are small kinetic sculptures that take advantage of bookbinding technologies. I'm a big believer, as you may have already noticed, in the value of iteration. The last one gives me the idea for the next one. Because they used to be kept in check by colder winters, these books are a beetle-written metaphor for an increasingly urgent message. Another thing I have learned from my series of burned tree paintings and bark beetle books is the value of collaboration. So far, I've worked with 2 foresters, 2 entomologists, an essayist, and a poet. Trying to understand the scientist's work gives me completely different ideas. These 2 most recent books are my largest yet. The one on the left unfolds to 19 feet long. The one on the right unfolds to 85 inches high, suspended from the ceiling. It represents the top 3 species in terms of beetle mortality in Washington State for the last 10 years. They're currently in an exhibit at the University of Puget Sound that is closed because of the coronavirus. I teach an occasional landscape workshop at Gage, and I'm always looking for good ways to bridge the learning gap between here are your pigments, see how they interact, to let's paint a landscape. I brought in a bag of fruits and vegetables, had people choose one, place it on a white sheet of paper, and paint it, so we could talk about composition, warm to cool colors, reflected light, colored shadows, reserving whites, etc., etc. When I looked at my demos, I realized they were quite good, in part because I didn't care as much about the final result. When I posted them on my blog, I got a comment from a Boston painter. She thought she was the only person using Shard to teach with. You can read our dialogue on my blog. I thought I'd try to show you how I go about painting them, as well as ways of presenting them. I'm going to try to approximate a demo without benefit of video camera. Here is my setup. 2 leaves of kale on a white background. Right now, an overhead light is on, but there's a small table lamp to the left out of the picture, which will cast more interesting shadows. I turned out the overhead light and did a loose pencil drawing. Here's a detail. I subscribe to the philosophy that if your drawing is too detailed and precise, you'll be too tempted to color in the lines and make a tight painting. I view whites as an opportunity for color. No shadow on a white surface should have to be gray. So the first and least controlled thing I do is wet the paper, leaving my subject area dry, and paint the shadows. I let them run, which they'll do wherever the paper is wet. I charge in whatever color either A, I think will complement the colors in the object, and or B, I charge in lots of additional color anyway. In this case, I first put down Dan Smith's cerulean blue, then charged in bits of Schmincke's ruby red, Winsor & Newton Hansa yellow, and some phthalo green. I'm not too worried about how closely it matches the actual shadow, just that it helps convey volume and depth and is interesting to look at. Next, I began laying in the lightest value colors in the kale leaves, the stems and the parts of the leaf that are catching the light values. Here I've begun to put in some of the middle dark values. I'm not trying to paint exactly what I see. More, I'm trying to suggest the textures. I'm taking a typical bumpy wart on the kale, the way it's lit here, and spreading them around the leaf. I'm also a big fan of reserving whites, so I try not to decide too early which ones to fill in. More of the same, but I've begun to add the darkest darks too, a mix of phthalo green and ruby red. Pretty much as filled in as I want it to get, maybe already too much detail. I like the saying, it takes 2 people to make a painting, the artist and the person to shoot the artist before they wreck it. We say, hands up, step away from the painting. So that's what I do next. I stand back about 6 feet. It's okay, but the upper center of the left-hand leaf isn't receding the way I want it to. A little darkening of that area should help the leaf feel like it's folding in on itself a bit more. Well, this is where I'm going to leave it for now. I'd look at it again tomorrow for any final tweaks. I always see them better at least a day later. A note about presentation. I had a show of vegetable paintings last summer at Food Art Collection. In thinking about how to present them, I thought people would probably put them in their kitchens. Conventional framing and glazing just seemed all wrong. Wax didn't seem right either. I wanted people to be able to wipe grease off them. So I mounted them on cradled panels and had a thin coat of epoxy poured over them. I like the clean but substantial profile. So that's all for now. Thanks for bearing with me in these trying times, and don't hesitate to ask questions. You can always contact me through my website. Bye-bye.